Hi, Saya. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hi, Grace. Great to be here.
Amazing to have another U of I alumni. So, first of all, for the audience to get to know you a little bit more, why don't we start with your journey prior to Jump Capital?
Yeah. So my journey into the startup ecosystem started pretty early on. My dad had always been an entrepreneur. He was
Mhm.
always kind of starting something new. So that was a world that I was attracted to from a very young age. It was kind of the only career path I really understood or knew, which is ironic because entrepreneurship in many ways is not a career path you can plan for.
Mhm.
Um, but I went to study computer engineering at University of Illinois, like you mentioned, kind of in hopes to get me to be a founder. I thought I was going to go build some really cool software, the next big tech play. Um, However, computer engineering was the hardest thing I ever did.
Mhm.
I realized pretty early on into college that it probably wasn't a career path I wanted to pursue. I didn't think that degree was going to help me build all of these things that I had the vision for. And so, because of that, I kind of interned and worked at a bunch of different companies in college, trying to figure out what I liked. Eventually, made my way to Boston Consulting Group in Chicago. Spent a few years consulting there. And I also spent about 8 or 9 months in their private equity practice. Um, so that was the first kind of tactical exposure I had to being a part of an investment process and really evaluating markets and deals from an investor perspective. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, I just loved the diligence nature of the work. I loved the type of strategic thinking that we were applying to these different markets. I didn't love the industries that we were focused on in the private equity practice. I remember working on like a chemical trucking roll up, and I just said, this is not the tech software that I've always been glamorized by. So that's kind of what led me back to venture. I said, I want to be earlier stage. I want to be doing software, but I really like this investment lens that we get to take and that I was exposed to through the PE practice. So I started looking for roles in venture. Um, One thing that was really key to me to find was proximity to founders. So I think every kind of firm has a different way of engaging and interacting with founders. But for me, I'd be lying if I said I don't still potentially have aspirations to be a founder one
Mhm.
day. I don't know what's on the other side of the table for me yet. And so I think without actually being in that seat, at least being close to them and being able to work very intimately with them and work hand in hand with them was really important for me from a learning perspective. And so that's how I found my way to Jump. And I've been here almost 4 years now.
Amazing. Okay, so I want to start with since AI is everywhere, like we briefly chat a little bit about the Amazon AI assistant, but just overall, like what's your thought about how big tech is playing in the AI ecosystem? And I feel like I recently have been asking a lot of guests about what's their take on where can startups succeed since AI is costing a lot of people are spending a lot of money into GPU and the data. Like big tech obviously have like a lot big advantages in that domain. So where do you see startup would even have opportunity to win in this category in
Yeah.
general?
I mean, it's not a novel thing that I'm going to say, but I think the biggest kind of learning from this AI evolution that hasn't existed in a lot of prior technological revolutions is just that the incumbents have such a powerful role that they can play, and they actually do have an advantage, right? I think
Mhm.
historically, incumbents, were slower to innovate, or they didn't have the resources, or whatever was required to be at the forefront of the new technology. But obviously, in this case, that's not true.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a couple opportunities or areas that startups need to think about to be successful. And I think it was Sam Altman himself who said, like, the startups that are doing it wrong are the ones who assume that the incumbents are not going to get better and that OpenAI will stay where it is today. And the ones that are doing it right, which is unfortunately the minority, are the ones that assume that all the foundation model providers, all the incumbents will continue to innovate and accelerate at the pace that they have. And the best startups are just going to either innovate faster or build into categories and areas that the incumbents just don't have an incentive to or won't because they're too niche for their kind of likings, right? And so
Mhm.
this leads into the, I think, vertical versus horizontal conversation that a lot of investors are having right now. Vertical SaaS hasn't seen the light of day in the past few years. It's been a rough market or category to be investing behind or to be a part of. But I think where there is so much opportunity today is in vertical applications, just because AI and generative AI fundamentally is exacerbating the very things that vertical software is good at, where I think horizontal software just has a much higher bar that they need to build into. And so happy to go deeper into that, but I don't want to go on a tangent on vertical SaaS. That's just generally how I think about the incumbents and where there's opportunity.
Totally. Okay, so I wanted to learn more about so yesterday I was chatting with another investor on the show about um essentially in the past when we think about where startup are built on, maybe like people are using like AWS or like Microsoft Azure or like Google Cloud. But nowadays, Nvidia coming into the play, they're building their own like ecosystem, team up with like some startups. What's your thought on in the future, how are the startup gonna choose like to where to build their startup on? And what are some factors to kind of factor in that space?
Yeah, it's that's a really hard question to answer, and I wish I knew the answer. But here's my thought. I mean, I think one, everybody is very early, I think, in still figuring out what the right configurations for themselves are, whether from a cost perspective or a latency, availability perspective. There's so many different, I think, determining characteristics into the kind of foundational architecture that startups are going to build upon, that you're seeing a lot of innovation happening, right? And so there's kind of these innovative chip or GPU cluster startups emerging. Twitter, which I still have a hard time calling X, just announced their for their GPU capacity. A16Z just bought a bunch of kind of compute hardware. And so there's a lot of these innovative models you're seeing come out that are not reliant on the big three software providers. That the other trend that I've noticed, so I think GCP is the one which in the past year has actually expanded their capabilities the most. It's had the highest growth rate, which has been consistent, but a lot of that is attributed to what they've done around AI. And same thing with Azure. They obviously have the benefit of being tied to Microsoft. The way that they've supported generative AI capabilities, I think, has surpassed some of the innovation that the other cloud providers have done. And so I think that race to new capabilities will continue to determine how startups build their capabilities. I don't think it's going to be a price factor. I mean, it's a race to the bottom, and cloud costs are already incredibly high. Again, I think it's who can innovate the fastest, and in the interim, I think there's going to be unique business models to try to leverage that capacity.
Totally. Okay, so I want to talk about what are some trends that you're seeing in the enterprise SaaS space? So a lot of people talk about like the AI assistants, and then I wonder what's your general thought on like some of the big trends that people are innovating in. And I feel like another. Okay, so I'll stop there. Let's go with this question first. Sorry. Like,
No, you're fine. Yeah, in enterprise SaaS, I think there's a couple interesting things happening, and I'll certainly get into like specific categories like you mentioned. And I'll caveat by like I think all of the conversation and trends in enterprise SaaS have to do with the impact of AI. So that's very much so what this will center around. I think first, a topic that is not getting enough attention, in my opinion, is how AI has fundamentally changed the selling process for enterprise software in a couple different ways. And so I think buyer behavior has dramatically shifted, and generative AI has elevated the build versus buy question into a lot more conversations than before. And so, generative AI allows for compressed software development costs. It's made certain applications easier to build in-house with less resources or less technical folks. And so the pressure on enterprise SaaS companies to be able to clearly articulate and showcase meaningful ROI to support a buy case and an implementation case and all the things that come with onboarding a new software is just a lot more difficult than I think it was before. Second, I think generative AI, even being a part of the conversation now, has kind of changed buyers' expectations on what SaaS is supposed to deliver. So I think every buyer now has some top-down mandate to ask what AI capabilities exist in any new software they're buying. And the reality is that generative AI is not yet needed or the best case in every single use case, right? But SaaS products are being expected to answer those questions. And I think a lot of buyers think that AI is like a magic wand, and they have this vision of what it should be able to do. And when a SaaS company can't actually do that, because it's a lot more difficult than buyers believe, they say, okay, I'm going to go look at the 20 other competitors out there because there's so many of them now, and they all claim to be able to do something like this. And it's just lengthening the sales cycle and the competitive nature. And so all of that to say is I just think that the sales process for enterprise SaaS has become increasingly difficult over the past couple of years, and especially in the past 18 months.
can we? So I'm so sorry. I
No.
think this is a really interesting point. I haven't really heard about that on the show yet, and I wonder, can you give us an example of like in the past, like what is the selling process kind of look like for a traditional SaaS startup, and then versus like now, like in the AI equivalent of that company, how are they selling it differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me try to think of an example that makes sense. Maybe we'll just take like a pure document processing use case, right?
Mhm,
Right. So there's so many verticals where they're incredibly documentation heavy. You need to generate reports on those documents. You need to summarize reports. Historically, there's been a ton of like IPA, RPA tools where you can configure workflows to intake different analytics and kind of text, et cetera, from documents and kind of templatize those into an output that makes sense for you. Um, and so those curated software, whether it be in contract analytics for legal, whether it be in contract analytics for finance, there was all of these kind of documentation workflow softwares that existed. Um, Now, for example, and so you could go to a customer and say, okay, we've pre-built your workflow. What takes you, X amount of time to do manually? You're uploading documents and your people are sifting through them manually. Now it takes a lot less time. It's faster time to revenue or more efficiency. So there was often a cost or a revenue kind of goal associated with it. Um, I think now the question is, okay, but I can just put all of this stuff into ChatGPT or into,
mhm,
one of the other incumbent providers. What are you doing that's so much better?
mhm,
I get 80% of the way there because most customers are okay getting 80 to 90% of the way there for their kind of rote tasks. It's only the very highly critical ones that they're willing to invest a meaningful amount of money in if they can deliver value, right? But getting 80 to 90% of the way there, or even 70% of the way there with your document processing, and then just needing a human to finish the last 20 to 30% is often the more inexpensive route than investing in a new software. And so creating that ROI case, I think, is what's fundamentally changed for enterprise SaaS companies today. And to be
mhm,
candid, I think a lot of companies are struggling with it. I think more and more CFOs are entering the conversation than have ever before. There's more multi-stakeholder sales happening because it's tech teams evaluating if the tech is truly better. It's the CFO evaluating if the cost to kind of headcount or whatever expense makes sense. And then it's the actual functional leader trying to prove that this is very much incrementally better than what they're currently doing or what a ChatGPT
mhm.
can provide. And so I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I think that's a little bit
Totally.
of how the process has changed.
Yeah, totally. This totally makes sense. So a lot of basically, essentially, the startups' core competency was kind of replaced by a cheaper alternative, which is ChatGPT.
And an easier alternative, right? I mean, ChatGPT in the early days wasn't always cheaper, but it was easier. You didn't have to onboard anything. You could just access it online. And that goes back to like the power of the incumbents and what startups need to be able to do and where they need to innovate or build capabilities to actually be not just 10 or 20% better, but 50 to 60% better.
Mm, totally. Okay, so this is amazing trend. And then okay, so let's keep talking about the other couple trends. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I break you down. I mean, I kind of stop you from like sharing the rest of the trends.
No, 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 absolutely. So I started to talk about it a little bit earlier, but I think AI is disproportionately impacting horizontal versus vertical software. I think this is a
Mhm,
conversation a lot of folks are having where there's a lot more fear over certain standalone kind of horizontal solutions becoming extinct or rolled into incumbent providers. It's this exact example is ChatGPT, or again, replace that with whatever provider you want, good enough to do the work. Not to say that there's not opportunity there, but I think you just really have to think about either from an integration perspective or a UI perspective, how you're going to build something differentiated. Where I think so much of the opportunity is and who's the true beneficiary is in vertical software, because again, I think AI just and generative AI specifically magnifies so many of the benefits of vertical software. So when you're seeing the most successful AI cases or where the moats are really being developed, it's smaller models with high quality data and domain specific data that they're being trained on. They're cheaper to run, they're more accurate, they result in higher efficacy, and frankly, they allow for a lot more automation. And so a model that understands your job fundamentally better than another model
mhm,
is likely going to be more trusted to go further into the decision making process than something general purpose, right? So instead of just elevating an output that you as a human then have to go make a decision on, something that is very curated, very trained to your specific process can actually go and take an action, right? And I think that's why you're seeing the rise, for example, of so many vertical specific conversational
mhm,
AI tools. There's this whole slew of like phone answering AI services that have now emerged for a bunch of different verticals, where if you can truly understand that vertical and whoever's calling in's needs, that you can actually go and automate like the scheduling or the task management behind it versus just, taking a voicemail, which was kind of the old version of conversational AI. And so that's one kind of element is I just think the verticalization and the vertical nature of AI within SaaS applications is taking off. That being said, I don't think that's going to make sense in every single vertical. The ones that I am very excited about kind of share a few characteristics. I think this is like home services, professional services, legal, accounting, even some medical practices like dental, for example, where these industries are typically very headcount intensive. So they're often low margin. A lot of them are suffering from labor gaps or talent shortages. They have low digitization. They have a ton of unstructured data, and they're highly fragmented industries. And because they're highly fragmented, historically, it's meant that SaaS companies need kind of a meaningful part of the long tail of the market in order to actually be big. And because of the lack of digitization, because of the lack of unstructured or the lack of structured data, I think historically implementing software and automation into these types of verticals just didn't make sense for either the customer or the vendor, right? So for a vendor, there would be a meaningful lift to extract the right data, clean that data, map that data, implement the product, and actually get customers onboarded. So that really quickly eats into your margins. And by the way, a lot of those customers there's really small, long tail of customers. And so really quickly, the economics just don't make sense for the vendor or the software provider, right? And I think the same is true on the buyer side, where the cost of switching, the difficulty of switching did not match the value that those companies could provide. I think all of that has significantly changed with generative AI, where its capabilities to handle unstructured data, to perform complex tasks that can actually mimic a human or put a stopgap in some of your labor shortage issues. I think because of that, there's a real pull right now from some of these historical verticals to modernize that haven't historically modernized. And so that's another trend that I'm really excited about. And I think, again, historically, VCs don't love to invest in industries that have a lot of SMBs. We love to invest in, companies that have big contract values and large logos. But I think that whole dynamic is changing as well.
Mm, totally. Okay, so I wonder, can you walk us through, like, maybe in the space that have you make a bet yet, or like, what's your thought framework on like evaluating these kind of startups in the vertical space? Because I feel like sometimes when you think about like, I mean, I could just think of like, some of the internet security startup they're selling to, let's call it, they're solving deepfake issues. A lot of people are trying to partner with bank or another or like maybe other type of places that where really needs this layer of security. However, selling it to a big bank or selling it to somewhere that's like a with like a chain store or something could be really hard. However, selling to SMBs, like maybe they don't have a really legit like use case on a day-to-day basis. Like how do you evaluate if the business model would work in these kind of vertical spaces where people are trying to leverage AI, but it's also very new for like when you mentioned about dental, like,
Yeah.
how do you think about like which part could be replaced by like an AI solution versus not? And how do you think about their like the pipeline of the startup they're trying to land, how realistic it is when they, for example, this like 75 logo on the pipeline that like, how do you kind of like recognize if this is like actually doable or not?
Yeah. I mean, look, sometimes we get it wrong, right? That's inherent in the job. But I think there's a couple maybe signals we look for. So one is I would certainly differentiate between horizontal companies that are going vertical from a distribution perspective. So this is where I put like AI security companies, AI governance companies. I spent a bunch of time in that category. And most of those are horizontal solutions. There's nothing specifically verticalized about the nature of their product, but from a distribution perspective, they are targeting, financial services or healthcare, the regulated industries first. So I think that's a little bit different of a model that you're evaluating than a truly verticalized solution, which the product inherently has something that's customized towards that vertical. So the workflows are specifically meant for, dental assistants or home services or whatever it may be. The data that's in that, the language that's used in that UI is all very specific. And so that's where I think there's a lot more interesting opportunity. I think, however, to your point, most of these industries have been slower to adopt automation. So they're almost 2 generations behind in terms of software,
Mhm.
not just 1 generation. And so modernizing it and talking about AI becomes really, really scary. And that's why I think you still have to be highly focused on problem centricity. I think AI has unfortunately incentivized like just a bunch of cool stuff to be built that's looking for a
Mhm.
problem that doesn't exist. And so I think the verticals where an AI application makes the most sense is where you don't actually have to talk about it being AI, right? And so
Mhm.
I'll give you some examples. I just talked to this company yesterday, so it's very top of mind. There's this business doing conversational AI for the home services business. And so home services, there's a massive amount of opportunity to generate from just answering the phone more because every
Mhm.
phone call you don't answer is lost business, right? Like we
Mhm.
don't have any loyalty to our plumbers or to our roofers or whoever it may be. We're just going to call whoever's available and answers first and gives you the right price, right? And so in that, if you can just solve the problem of answering the phone faster and better and giving customers a better experience just in that initial interaction, that is a meaningful ROI. However, that hasn't been done before because home services is complex. There's a lot of questions that goes into answering the phone, and you can't just do it with like a general purpose solution, right? And so you actually need to be able to understand the problem. You need to be able to understand the urgency, the complexity. Then you need to map that back to your system and say, what technician is on this route today that can actually fulfill this request. And so it's a long way of saying I think there's a lot of these like low hanging fruit problems that haven't
Mhm.
historically gotten solved because they were very difficult to solve from a
Mhm.
vertical and complexity perspective, but they're again just really low hanging fruit and very high value if you can just incrementally change like one part of the stack. And so I think customer engagement is a place where I'm seeing a lot of that start to emerge across different verticals. Is just interacting with your top of funnel better because again, there's just a huge I think ROI to be delivered if you can just convert a higher number of your leads, right?
Mhm. Totally. Okay, so if we're talking about like what you mentioned about like helping the plumbers to pick up the phone faster, so but like since like the SMBs typically, I feel like they're less likely to invest a lot of money into different tools. How do you like you mentioned about like having meaningful ROI? How do you prove the
Yeah,
ROI part when the data sample size maybe like really varies? So for example, sometimes like maybe AI wouldn't be able to answer a particular question. Like let's say, for example, if I ask you, hey, to choose this particular toilet versus this one, like I mean, can you fix this particular name of like
yeah,
whatever the it's like name? So I wonder like how do you like
yeah,
solve also like I feel like the ticket size will be a lot lower than like the traditional enterprise sales cycle, which is you sell it to a major company and then the major company do one decision and then the whole company will be using this SaaS product.
yeah.
Um, I feel like there's just so many problems to be solved. And I wonder how do you kind of justify if this is like a big enough problem that people are willing to like a large amount of plumbers are willing to spend money on.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know if you can build a big business on plumbing alone. You probably have to aggregate a number of services. But for the sake of the conversation, I think um, eh, tell me if I don't answer all of your questions. But I think the first part is this goes back to what you were saying about like how do you sell AI? I think a lot of these businesses, especially in services, whether it's home, professional services, medical, et cetera, these very people oriented roles, they just want things to work the way they should. Right.
Mm,
And so they don't really care how the back end works. They don't care what AI mapping you're doing or the taxonomy you've created on the back end. Their measure of success is are we answering more calls and are we converting more customers? Right. And that's you can prove or disprove that value pretty quickly. It's actually a lot more immediate than trying to sell like an efficiency use case, for example,
mm,
and trying to measure people's productivity hours
mm,
over a long period of time. I think it's actually pretty straightforward to just measure a very discrete outcome, which in a lot of these verticals that have again failed to automate for so many years, there's just so
mm,
many of those little incremental steps you can take that have a meaningful improvement on either your revenue or your cost. And so I actually don't think it's about like selling the value of AI or
mm,
anything like that. It's a very kind of discrete KPI. And then going back to kind of the data mapping and like the accuracy of that, that is hard to prove. But again, I think a lot of these customers don't necessarily care about that. They just want to see the output. And that is inherently the beauty of verticalizing, right? And so that's why, you know, you have general purpose conversational AI software that's been around for a long time, but it's actually a non trivial task to go and map that to every specific vertical complexity again. So I was giving the example of like plumbers and all of the technician requirements or credentialing that you might need to have, all of the route logistics information that you need to have. You need to map that back into whatever their core system of record is. And so it might be Service Titan, it might be an Excel sheet if they're a really small shop. And so that mapping is actually very difficult to do. And again, that inherently is why I think there's an opportunity for a verticalized software versus just something horizontal or general purpose where they won't be able to build those. And then you had another question about just like contract values, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is the age-old question about vertical SaaS, I think, is like, is the market big enough? And it's either there's not enough customers in that niche vertical to sell to, or a lot of these vertical industries are just made up of a huge long tail where people aren't going to pay high contract values. I think this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about in the past couple of months because I spend a lot of time in vertical SaaS. And so it's not fun to think that all these markets are too small to invest in. I think fundamentally there's a lot of case studies or examples of times that investors have gotten this wrong, right? And so I was just reading one about Viva, for example, which is just an industry-wide solution for the life sciences industry. When they initially started, 2013, I think, over 10 years ago. I forgot exactly which product capability it was, but they just had one product. And a lot of their investors or potential investors said this market cap is incredibly limited and it's not going to go anywhere, or it's going to cap out at a very discrete rate because the market's just too small. And that's now, a multi-billion-dollar organization. They proved that TAM expansion is possible over time just by creating new products. And so that leads me to like, what do you need to believe to actually get really excited about a vertical company that's selling into SMBs? It's either A, that they have the capability to expand into other verticals, which is not always going to be the case, right? If you're selling into healthcare, it's probably not that easy to go into financial services. But if you're selling into plumbing, there's probably a bunch of other home services that do logically make sense. So you either A, need to believe there's a very logical vertical expansion from both a distribution and a product perspective. B, or the second thing you may need to believe, I think it's either or, is that there's a product expansion capability, right? And that's why you see the most successful vertical SaaS companies move into things like marketplace software or payment software, right? That's the story of Toast. And so those are hard things to evaluate, honestly. And I think often that is why we as investors will miss great vertical SaaS opportunities, because you are kind of betting on this upside that doesn't exist yet and there's no proof points around it. But when you can get confidence around that, that's where a lot of the magic happens.
Totally. I wanted to learn more about like also like when you're looking at the founder background. So a lot of times, like as an angel investor, so like when I see the founder, I'm like, they're all amazing, but some of the founders don't have relevant work experience and the exact problem they're solving, or like um maybe they have like passion for that problem, but they have not proven that they have solved that problem yet. How do you kind of like quickly identify which founder or which team is like a fully ensemble team to go after a particular problem versus I feel like a lot of times people are just like, oh, it's all about the team, or sometimes all about the market or something. But I feel like it's really hard to identify like among the very smart people crowd, like who is gonna able to actually create the product that that particular industry is needing.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, it's really challenging to evaluate founders because I do think they're a key part in getting an investment right or wrong. But the challenge is like there's not a lot of patterns you can draw from successful or unsuccessful founders. I mean, we have tried, trust me, and it's not easy to like bucket human characteristics. But I think the unfortunate answer is it depends, right? And so I think in like vertical software, especially when you're selling into some of these antiquated industries, domain expertise is highly required because one, you need to curate your product in a highly customer-centric way. You need to know exactly what their workflows are and where the biggest pain points are, which are often going to be very different from an onlooker's perspective versus somebody who's actually done the work. Sometimes you hear about a pain point that you wouldn't even realize existed, right? But somebody who's doing that work day in and day out might just find something super mundane but super high value if you can fix that. And so I think from a product perspective, you need to understand the workflow, but also like, again, these are legacy industries that are not super excited to automate sometimes, or they're nervous about it, or they don't understand the new technology. They're a couple generations behind. In many cases that is true. And so I think there's a level of credibility that comes from being in the space that
Mm.
is just hard to replicate if you're, and again, an outsider coming in and just have a lot of passion. It's not to say there aren't successful founders in vertical SaaS who have come from different industries, but I do think in vertical software, it's a lot more critical. However, I don't believe that to always be true, right? I think like there's horizontal software you can build. There's other categories of businesses that you can build. Maybe as a consumer of a problem, maybe as a manager of a problem, maybe you weren't directly experiencing it, but you were on the opposite side of it. So I've heard of a lot of kind of sellers, for example, go and build like procurement software
Mhm.
because they saw how broken the process was and they were trying to sell to their buyers. They said, let me go fix that problem. So I think tangentially, you do need to have been around the problem, even if you were not in the driver's seat of that. But honestly, I think what gets me most excited about a founder um, is this combination of two things that's really hard to find. It's you need founders who love to operate, which a lot of founders don't love to operate. They love to innovate. But building a good, big business takes like, real operation chops. And so
Mhm.
you need somebody who truly wants to operate. But you also need somebody who continually iterates and ideates, right? And I think, again, finding the convergence of both of those is really, really hard. I think you often just find these like seasoned executives, or you find these incredibly product oriented people who just want to keep building the new coolest thing. But we've seen it time and again. Oftentimes, those people lack the customer centricity that's needed to say, okay, I might actually need to pull back on this innovation to deliver what's going to make me successful. And so when you can find the balance of that, that's a really magical thing.
For sure. I really like what you said about like product oriented people because I feel like there's a lot of amazing engineers or amazing like technical talent in the Bay Area. But like I think like when I just observed like one of my friends' company, they have like how fast they have been iterating based off like the customer feedback. It was just phenomenal. So I feel like seeing people who are successfully like keep like like improving their product is like very exciting versus like getting fixated on particular type of technology. So we talk about like two trends in the enterprise SaaS space. Is there something you want to add or you want to switch to like the second topic about the AI at work?
Um, I think enterprise SaaS, I've covered a lot. I mean, I'm happy to talk about a couple other areas that we find interesting in enterprise SaaS.
Okay,
SaaS. I
go for
promise
it.
I won't keep talking about vertical SaaS because I've probably beaten that drum too long. But yeah, I think just like generally, there's a couple other categories that we've gotten really excited about recently in enterprise SaaS. One is the go-to-market stack. And so, I mean, I think CRMs have been one of the highest category of investment, believe it or not, this year or this past quarter or something like that, which is kind of
Yeah.
wild to think about. It feels like it came out of nowhere. But the GTM stack generally, I think, has proliferated so rapidly over the past few years, right? I think customer acquisition got really hard. It got really expensive. So people were just throwing dollars at trying to figure out what could work, what could stick. And even like a slight improvement in your sales process was meaningful enough to keep that in your stack. And so now what you're seeing is all of these disparate tools and data sources that exist in somebody's go-to-market stack. And that's making it really hard for people to get a holistic, deep picture on customer behavior. So whether that's getting the right like feedback loop from your product team on what customers care about, whether that's getting the right feedback from like field marketing into sales, right? So we're seeing the rise of events come back. I think the threading together of that data and the story that it tells has just become very, very difficult with the fragmentation of solutions. And so anything that either makes it easier to automate intake or enrich data or more proactively generate insights after threading together and aggregating all of this data, I think there's a massive opportunity for those types of solutions. And you're
Mhm.
seeing a ton of them emerge. So there's also a lot of noise and a lot of competition, but that's certainly a category that we're very excited about. And the other one I'll maybe quickly mention that we've spent a pretty significant amount of time in the past kind of 12 months is around AI and model governance. So again, there's a lot of these companies that have emerged: Credo AI, FairNow, Trustable. I mean, the list goes on, and these are distinct from AI cybersecurity companies, just kind of regulatory governance and compliance. Um, where I also think that's going to be a critical part of the risk stack. I think we're a little bit early in the evolution of those companies, which is kind of why we're waiting and seeing where we want to potentially place a bet. But I do think that that's going to be a very critical part of the risk stack, and that over time you will also start to see some of these governance tools verticalize for industries that have very specific regulations. So you're already seeing that in financial services. You'll see it in insurance. You'll see it in healthcare, where there will be specific, I think, AI governance and model governance tools catered to the regulations for those industries.
Totally. Okay, so in terms of like the impact of like AI at work,
Yeah.
what are something that you feel like is the most exciting part? And um maybe I feel like this is a really big question about AI at work because
Yeah.
everyone's work is kind of different. And maybe we can separate them into a few categories. Since like you're the expert in enterprise SaaS, one big part I would think is AI is gonna improve the efficiency of how people code in general. I feel like dev tools is like this is like a really big category for like AI to kind of make a huge change. And then nowadays, like the coding barrier for a regular human to build something really sophisticated is like very, very low. It's getting a lot lower than before. What's your thought on the future of engineering in general? And I'll save like the rest of the question later. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, just
Mhm,
code and software development has been probably the fastest and
mhm,
highest volume category to adopt generative capabilities. And that's no surprise. I think that will continue. I think the efficacy of what some of these tools are able to produce from a code perspective is very impressive and has accelerated really rapidly. And so I think that will continue. And I think you actually hit on a point that I think is very critical to how we think about the future of work and how it's going to be impacted by AI, which is that I think different roles are going to get impacted disproportionately. And there's a lot of data and studies that have already been done out there that are saying kind of lower performers or just less experienced people are benefiting the most dramatically from generative AI, because they are now able to meet the bar of either more experienced people or the best performers a lot quicker with less training. Maybe inherently they don't even develop the knowledge, but they just have the right tools to produce the same output.
mhm,
And so generally, I think while that's a very positive impact on engineering, I think it is going to cause us to rethink the type of people that we hire and the skill sets required, right? So
mhm,
maybe a traditional four-year degree at a top engineering school is no longer
mhm,
required to work at the best tech companies. And that I think that trend was already starting to go away a little bit. I think there's been a lot more respect and credibility given to like self-learning, self-coders and boot camps and all of these other kind of outside of university programs over the past couple
mhm,
of years. And so I think engineering will lead the way in how they think about adopting AI, but I think they might adopt it in a way that's a little bit different than other industries or other functions just because they have been so much on the forefront of that already.
mhm,
The one other really interesting thing or piece about engineering and development in generally where I think AI will have a massive impact is just on the number of like new application developers it will create. So when, Apple came out with the App Store, the number of like new businesses that were launched just because mobile
mhm,
applications were possible, the number of new application developers that rose up, the number of entrepreneurs that resulted in that was pretty incredible. And I think you're going to see the same thing with generative AI applications being built, both from engineers themselves, but that's also being fueled by a lot of essentially like low code, no code parallel tools to
mhm.
create AI applications. So, um, yeah, I think there's a lot of progress already being made in the engineering world, honestly. And I think it's a good model for where positive impact can happen using AI.
Totally. Is there some like particular company that you're really excited about? So the other day I went to a event at like basically a top like a venture firm in the Silicon Valley, and then people were demonstrating like a lot of tools that are replacing engineer in general, like which is
Mhm.
not replacing an engineer in general. So it's just like kind of like AI help you to generate a lot of code. So that's like the general one of the general direction that I'm seeing in the developer tool category. And what are some other things that you feel like are very interesting in this space in general?
I mean, to be completely honest, Grace, I don't spend a ton of time in like developer tooling. So I probably don't have the best lens on what like the engineering tooling landscape looks like. Um, There are a couple pretty interesting ones we've seen that are automating like code documentation, for example,
Mm,
which in some cases sounds trivial, but there is some pretty intensive documentation that goes into like the translation between hardware and software code
mm,
or different machine languages. So I think that's pretty interesting because those are mundane tasks that engineers don't want to do.
mm,
It's the worst part of their job, right? They just want to build cool stuff. And so I think anything that's like kind of documentation heavy that allows engineers to free up their time is really interesting. Another example of this is actually in the model governance space. And so we spent a lot of time looking at model governance as it applies to financial services organizations. And just for the sake of context, like there's pretty robust kind of model validation that goes into all financial services models that they're creating, whether they have AI or not. That's been around for many years. And these are like PhD data scientists, PhD engineers, very, very technical people, and they absolutely hate putting together documents and reports on their models.
Mhm.
And so that's another area where I think if you can actually automate that piece of it, it allows them to do the fun model building that they like. And so, yes, I think there's a ton of opportunity in like code generation, especially low hanging fruit code or like syntax translation and things like that. But I think a lot of the more interesting stuff is actually on how do you allow engineers to do the stuff they like and take away the stuff that they really don't like, but is meaningfully important.
Totally. Can you share a little bit more about like since you mentioned like model governance space, like what is considered as like the model governance space? And then I guess like also how does the money flow? Are who are people selling to and like what are some innovation in the space?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to think about model governance or different
Mhm.
components of it. So there is the overarching just am I in compliance with like different regulatory requirements, right? And
Mhm.
there's old regulatory requirements that you still need to be conscious of and that your use of AI might impact. And so those are data privacy and fair
Mhm.
lending and all of these things that have been around forever are still in consideration. And then there's new AI laws that are coming out, right? We've all seen them. And so I think there's this whole suite of companies that's coming out that's just saying, okay, are you in compliance with these different policies? And so they'll
Mhm.
actually evaluate the models that you're using or that you're building. Maybe you have a third party providing them and saying, okay, according to what this model does, these are the things that you need to be in compliance with.
Mhm.
And then a lot of them are even going a step deeper, but this is harder and plugging into your development pipelines, your CI/CD systems, and saying, okay, we've run the analysis on these different outputs
Mhm.
or the data that you're inputting, and we're giving you a score on your bias or your compliance with this specific threshold. So there's that at like a very general purpose level is just making sure you're in compliance with what the regulatory frameworks say. Um, Underneath that, there's a lot of model governance companies that are just trying to help you govern your models and their outputs against what you as a business care about, right? So there's a lot
Mhm.
of risks that a model runs that you might not get in regulatory trouble for, but you just don't want your business to do that, right? Like
Mhm.
maybe outputting something toxic or outputting a hallucination to a customer. And
Mhm.
so there's a whole slew of kind of model evaluation companies that have come up to actually test
Mhm.
against very specific use cases. So Patronus AI is a pretty popular one in that category that recently raised their Series A. Um, and they're building very specific kind of unit tests for different hallucination
Mhm.
cases or bias cases. And so that's also a piece of model governance I would consider. I think some people might call it a different category. And then there's the verticalized model governance. And so I brought up financial services. That's a really interesting category because they have had model governance kind of rules and regulations in place for a long time, and they actually have nothing to do with AI. AI
Mhm.
is just exacerbating the problem. And so
Mhm.
that's really interesting because there's already very specific mandates and laws out there about how you are supposed to govern your models. And there's just new tools that are now helping banks and FIs do that for AI models, right? Because AI models fundamentally are going to act differently than your statistical models or your Excel models, and so they require new capabilities. And so, yeah, that's kind of the full category of model governance that we're looking at. And then again, I think there's a ton of tangential stuff around that, whether it's security or data privacy or you name it.
Totally, I'm taking notes, and I wonder, so, can I like, I'm just guessing the business logic is like, assuming they're selling to like the bigger players in the industry or like, having some sort of like maybe I would call it like a mid-sized startup kind of, that's a category. For example, I would assume it's like, for example, the government would have a certain legal requirement, or compliance requirement for these, bigger company, and then they would spend time like, they would spend, money on it's kinda like a Vanta sort of situation of, like, where a company would help you meet the security standard. Is that, like, how it works? Or how like, I mean, who is, like, actually spending money in the industry, and how does, like, the I guess, like, how does the money flow in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. You asked and I didn't answer, so I apologize. I think there's a few different kind of business models we're seeing, and I think people are trying to figure out still what the right one is. And so, one, a lot of the big regulated industries, FIs, healthcare, insurance, et cetera, are paying
Mhm.
consultants to do a lot of this work today, right? And so there's just a huge services fee that they're saying if we can bring in house, or if we can pay this software vendor to do it for half the cost, like we already have that spend allocated. And so we'll just pay you kind of this either SaaS fee to do it on a recurring basis. So there are certain requirements that require like annual reporting, or sometimes just on a one-off basis, right? And so I just need to validate this one model, or I just need to check the box on this bias requirement once in 5 years. So I'll just pay you kind of a one-time fee for the report. And so that's kind of the standard model we've seen for a lot of businesses. I think over time, as ongoing and continuous monitoring becomes more and more important, and I think the reason that's going to happen is because just the nature of generative AI models, they're constantly learning from new data. They're constantly getting better. So I think they're going to require a very continuous kind of governance cycle, which is a little bit different than I think other governance categories. I think once that happens, you'll start to see either more like usage-based fees, and so akin to development platforms, where or maybe you'll see, again, just traditional SaaS pricing. Maybe you'll see modular monetization based on, okay, we're going to run these like 6 tests. And so each test costs something different. But generally, it's the large enterprises that are paying this. And again, most of them are already paying this budget to somebody else today, or have some kind of budget already allocated towards it. And it typically sits under risk and compliance, I would say.
Totally. I wonder when you were thinking about, so you mentioned a little bit more about like, the on the financial services side. So what are some like AI companies that you feel like are interesting in that domain?
Yeah, there's a couple. So there's this business Ethos AI that I'm a big fan of, both the founders, Jet and Mike there. I'm a big fan of the company, and they're helping to do exactly this. They're early stage, but they are actually automating the workflows around model risk management. And so model risk management is a function. It's called MRM at financial services, that contains or is composed of multiple different functions within that. So there's the risk team, there's the data scientists, there's model developers, there's model owners, which might be like the credit team. So there's just a lot of different parties involved and stakeholders involved, and it becomes a very long, very iterative process. And so they're helping kind of thread together that full workflow, which is super interesting. There's another company called ValidMine that's doing something pretty similar that raised funding, I think late last year. And then there's another business called Prove AI in this space, which targeting the same function, but why they're so interesting is they're not actually focused on automating the workflow between those different functions. They're focused on actually automating the validation. And so all the work that the data scientists are doing to test the model and pressure test certain factors of the model, they're trying to kind of automate all of that data science and testing elements into one platform. So a little bit more of the technical elements versus the workflow elements. So those are the 3 major ones that I've seen. But I do think there's going to be a lot more innovation that comes out in this category over the next couple of years, especially as you see more and more regulators enforce some of these laws across different FI segments.
Totally. What are the, so like, so I guess like when it comes to these type of companies, like what's their kind of go-to-market strategy? Is that just like they, like, do they have to sell to like a category of company? You mentioned like, for example, financial services company. Who will need this kind of services? Is that the Fidelity of the world, or like how, like who
Yeah.
are they targeting? And then how are startup kind of entering the space? Because I would assume like, first of all, like anything regards to compliance, I would try to find a company that have been doing compliance for like 65 years. 65 years, I'm completely wrong. But I would assume like they want someone who is like very, very stable, and like AI, it's like such a new space, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure like to even keep track with what you need to do to stay compliant would need a lot of work. How are the founders kind of like capturing these both like the market and the trying to catch up with the innovation in the space?
Yeah. I'll answer maybe that question first. I think there's a couple things I would say. One, to your point, there's these like gargantuan governance, risk, and compliance providers for all of these industries that have existed for a long time. And I think the simple answer is most of them aren't that innovative, right? I know that's like the easy answer whenever you're talking about incumbents, but we've talked to lots of customers using these products, and they're saying they're not flexible enough. They're not deeply embedded enough to actually do the work that I need them to do. So I want to look for a new solution. And I would actually trust a new provider who knows AI better than some of these incumbent providers, because I don't think that they can fulfill it. So we've actually directly heard from, bank buyers, for example, that they want a new solution that's specifically focused on AI model governance versus just general compliance. The other thing that I think is super interesting when you get into governance around AI and models is that it actually requires a much more embedded technical element than like general compliance, right? And so general compliance tools, typically how they work is, they tell you all the policies you need to be in compliance with, and they'll map it to like your processes and your workflows. Again, when you're looking at models, oftentimes you have to actually be embedded in the development pipelines and understand the technical architecture and builds of those models to determine if they're compliant. It's not just a workflow. And I think that's fundamentally a different product than what a lot of the compliance solutions that already exist today are, right? Which are, again, much more workflow based versus kind of technically integrated into development pipelines. And so that's one answer. In terms of you asked about like who are they selling into, and obviously that's very difficult, which is very true. So today the most pressure is being seen like at the largest banks, kind of 30-40 billion of AUM and above. So I'd call them tier 1, tier 2 banks essentially. But a really interesting trend that we've started to see in the past 18 or so months is that even the small banks, even the fintechs are coming under a ton of regulatory scrutiny, and you're just seeing regulators move more and more downstream. So I think over time, and honestly in the near to midterm, not long term, all FIs are going to be under pretty strict scrutiny around how they're complying with AI and model governance, especially anything that is incredibly consumer facing. So all of these kind of robo advisors or personal wealth managers have to be really careful about the AI tools they're putting out there and if they're giving advice via those AI tools. And so I think because those kind of the fintechs and the smaller FIs are innovating a little bit faster, they're actually attracting a lot more regulator attention. And so overall, the scrutiny, I think, is becoming very pervasive for AI governance in a way that it perhaps didn't pervade prior for other rules.
Totally. Okay, so I want to also dive a little bit deeper into the AI cybersecurity domain. Can you categorize so this domain, like what is considered like under the AI cybersecurity space? I'm mostly aware of like the deep fake related
Yeah.
situation. As like basically, I feel like that's on every investor's mind of solving that issue. And what is also within the cybersecurity domain that you feel like are really interesting to look at?
Yeah, there's a multitude of different approaches I've seen. I think kind of the one that I'm seeing the most often is just this concept of like data masking and data redaction. And so it's really centered on data privacy. So everybody is really concerned that my employees are using ChatGPT and they're going to send something private to the cloud. Or the inverse is going to happen where my employees are using an enterprise version of ChatGPT and they're going to ask it a question and they're going to get information back that they're not allowed to get. Right. And
Yeah,
so like,
yeah.
asking, what does my CEO get paid or something like that? And
Yeah.
so so like the most, I think, initial form of cybersecurity companies that I've seen a lot of, again, are focused on like masking and redacting data before you send it to the cloud, and then potentially even masking it on the way back or implementing things like role-based access control into your AI logins at the very start, right? And so as Saaya, you can only access this kind of segment of our knowledge base, or you can only ask these types of questions, or, there'll be a red flag that comes up if you ask something that you're not allowed to ask, or you won't get the response. And so that's, I think, like the very fundamental basic that most companies need to do just to get up to speed with what their employees are already doing in terms of interacting with AI. Then the deeper you get into actually building AI yourself or implementing it, there's a lot of different security solutions that are emerging. And by the way, I think this category is super nascent. So while there is a lot of well-funded players already, I think there's going to continue to be a lot more innovation that happens here. So one category, like you mentioned, is deepfake. I'm seeing a lot of startups emerge there, both from a video and an image perspective, but even more so from an audio perspective, which I think is an even more interesting category, just given how pervasive audio is in terms of different use cases and also how much harder it potentially is to detect audio. And so definitely seeing a lot of companies emerge there. And there's already been cases of fraudulent attacks via AI phone calls. And so I think that's a really critical area. And then we're seeing a lot of companies that are focused on kind of the red teaming aspects or penetration testing of different AI models that I think you have to be a little bit more advanced in your AI development and implementation cycles to kind of need those solutions. But we're certainly starting to see a bunch pop up there.
Totally. I wonder, in terms of like, let's say, so like the company that are solving these problems, for example, deepfake for the voice deepfake, what are the current solutions? So so far I've seen people trying to mask, not mask, but like label like a original voice of certain things, and then from the technology perspective, I'm non-technical, so like I don't know how to describe the technical solution that they have provided, but like
Yeah.
from my understanding, it's like labeling the original data to um and then if people are generating things on top of it, like you have the original thing that's already labeled. I don't know how to label a voice,
Yeah.
but
Uh,
how like from like a general perspective, like how is it different? Like how do you even verify if something is deep faked in general?
yeah, it's if I knew the answer to that question very acutely, I maybe would go build it myself. But I think there's a couple ways. So one of the most common techniques today is watermarking,
Mhm,
which is it's I mean it is what it sounds like, but it's obviously from a digital perspective. So providing a digital watermark to either an image or kind of doing it at the pixel level, so
mhm,
it can't be modified as easily. Doing that on audio, so that with the right software and technology, you can actually understand the origin um, of a piece of content, whether that be audio or image. And I've actually started to see some people take like blockchain driven approaches because of the nature
mhm.
of blockchain and how that's non-modifiable, to do the same thing and actually understand like chain of custody essentially, and have that audit trail. So that's one of the biggest ways I've seen it done. Um, I think there are some novel techniques that have emerged around like just running a bunch of tests against a certain image, and you can actually kind of reverse engineer. And again, I'm not saying that probably the most technically
Mhm.
correct way because I haven't spent a ton of time in that category, but essentially like reverse engineer if it was generated by a model or not. But it is a very complex category. It's a very complex problem that I think is still not solved for acutely, and yeah, will take some time.
For sure. What are some other things that you feel like are really, you mentioned about like, the enterprise level, people are trying to solve the problem of like if you Google like other people's salary in the company. So like so I guess like what are some solution in that domain that like how do you block people from, is that just like setting different access to different level of data? I would assume you just block the data, right? Like you just lock this is only HR only or like at a
So
certain level or something?
you lock the data essentially. It's essentially the same as like traditional role-based access control. It's just applied
Mhm,
to AI applications, right?
mhm,
And there are some complexities, like some people may not want to block, maybe not all my access to HR data, but just my access to specific salary bands. But
mhm,
anybody who works under me, maybe I get to see. And so that also requires and implies that you need to have pretty sophisticated like data tagging and structure on the back end in order to be able to actually enforce those access controls. And so some security companies, I think, are starting to think about how to bake that to the stack or have this like automated onboarding mechanism to actually map your data for you against what the right control mechanisms are. And so, yeah, role-based access control and like identity mapping is not a novel cybersecurity measure, but I think it's novel in how it's getting applied to AI applications.
mm. Okay, so we are almost hitting the time. I wanna, like, end with, like, a quick one-minute fire round for you. Okay,
Yeah.
so first of all, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book. Oh gosh. Oh wow, I really hate that question. Um, Red Notice, maybe.
Oh, nice. What's your, uh what like, who made the biggest impact in your career?
Oh, that's also a really hard question. It's a very cliche answer, but probably my father.
Who would you invite to a dinner party?
Serena Williams. I'm a huge tennis fan. I play tennis, so
What's your content diet for the AI space?
what's my what?
Content diet for the AI space.
Oh gosh. Um, Content diet for the AI space. I get a lot of newsletters, but honestly, I just like reading VC's opinions. So like all the big firms put out interesting stuff about AI. NFX put out a really interesting perspective a few months ago. Sequoia, all of them do. So I just like to get the different perspectives from VCs, honestly, which maybe is the wrong way to do it, but that's my content diet.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Usually not in my home. I travel a lot, so probably in a different state or a different country or at
Is
a
there
wedding.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is like another on the spot question. What is a question you ask founder every time?
Um, I don't know if this is a unique question, but I don't know if everybody always asks it the first time. I always ask, "What are you looking for in an investor?" Not necessarily because I need to like flatter myself or figure out how to pitch, which obviously helps, but more so just like I'm always very curious to hear how they're thinking about it. And is it just we need money to go succeed, or is there some like real thoughtfulness to the partnership that they're trying to create? Because I think that has a huge impact on their ability to succeed with venture capital money.
Oh, wow. I feel like a lot of founders hearing this, they would all want to work with you. Uh,
I That's the hope.
Amazing. Well, Saya, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. This has been a pleasure, and I appreciate you having me.
Okay, let me quickly answer